Hello, I'm Jeff Nodell. It's Friday. Oh gosh, it's Friday the 13th. That's not good. With me today is Necia Quast. Necia is a wonderful person who's a member of the League of Women Voters of the San Juans, right? Hi, Necia. Okay. And is her audio okay, Jeremy? Yes. Okay. Very, very quiet, but I'm going to turn my audio way up. And you are one of the key people who covers county meetings, junior taxing districts. Do you do the school board?
The Observer Corps does the school board. I don't cover it personally.
Okay. Well, it's a wonderful service. And it's something that, San Juans today just doesn't have the capacity to cover all those meetings. And if we did, I'm not sure that we would do at all a better job than you guys do. Your work is accurate and credible and well written, and so I'm just so grateful for what you do, and I know many people are.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It's always nice to know when you're doing all that work that people appreciate it.
Great. So Necia, we're here to talk about your attendance as an observer to the COP, or you call it COP29, International Conference on the Environment, right?
On climate change.
Climate change. And so why don't we just get started with that? But first, I think we should talk about your career in diplomacy. So why don't we just start with how you learned it and how you got into the world of diplomacy?
Well, when I was in high school and I was trying to decide where to go to college. And so I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. And I read an article in 17 magazine called 30 Careers Girls Usually Don't Think About, one of which was Foreign Service Officer. And when I read the description, I said, that's it. That's what I want to do. So subsequently, I majored in international relations. When I graduated, I took the Foreign Service exam. I was fortunate enough to pass the written the first time around. It took 2 times to pass the oral exam, but then when I was 23, I got into the Foreign Service and as an economics officer and diplomat, and I subsequently served overseas in 8 countries with the State Department, mostly as an economist.
What was it about diplomacy that attracted you, do you think?
The opportunity to travel, the opportunity to see the world, to see a bigger picture, and to experience, just to have a wide range of experiences and gain more understanding of the world.
Is it real competitive? Is it a very competitive thing to get into that, or is there an ever a constant need for more people to get into diplomacy?
It is very competitive to get in. For the U.S. State Department, the requirements are fairly few. There, that you're a U.S. citizen, that you're 21 or older, that you're willing to serve worldwide, and the most challenging is that you pass the Foreign Service exam. So there's no specific required educational or experience requirements. It's based on passing the exam. But it's considered a very tough exam. Back when I was taking it, about 25,000 people took the written exam each year. About 10% would pass that and go on to the oral exam. And again, 10 to 12% would pass that. So it's down to sort of 1% of the people that originally take it pass it. And then you get on a register listed by your scores, and they hire from the top of the register down as they're filling positions. So,
okay. So I would say that's pretty competitive.
It's pretty competitive.
Yeah, I would say so. And it seems to attract the best of the best, right? Very, very bright people. Of course, you're not talking about yourself, but all your colleagues, right? I mean,
yes, it's
very smart.
I think what I like about it is because, again, it's just by the exam. People, some people have the kind of credentials you would expect. They're coming from sometimes high-level academics, people who have experience in business and law and other endeavors. But it can also be people who are just very smart but don't fit the mold, but who can pass the exams. So you get a very interesting mix of people with a broad range of experiences, I think, that you don't necessarily get in other ways of hiring people to kind of a cookie cutter standard.
I'm not hearing that it's very political. Are politics and connections largely outside of this process?
Yes, for the career foreign service, yes. However, a significant portion of the positions in the State Department are filled by political appointees who change each administration. So there's a strong political element within State Department leadership.
I just imagine about how that career in being in, what did you say, 8 different nations for extended amounts of time, living with the people, immersing in the cultures. I just imagine that you are informed by every one of those stops, right? Every one of those places.
Yes.
And that affects your values, I would think, in some ways.
Certainly. I mean, when we were they bring people in together in a group and you go through an orientation training. So everybody has a foreign service class. And when I was in that training, our course coordinator said, you will come to consider yourself a citizen of the world. Even though you're always representing US interests, you will feel, that you are a citizen of the world.
So as a citizen of the world and a citizen of the United States, you traveled to the other side of the world last month to observe the COP29 conference, international conference. Why don't you set up what that was?
Yes. So the Paris Agreement, which was signed back in the early 90s, was the vast majority of countries in the world signed an agreement to jointly address the issue of global warming, which has then sort of morphed into climate change in the terminology, that was clearly a threat to everybody, and that cannot be addressed by any one country. It's going to take collective action to address this collective threat. So they signed that agreement, and every year, all of the parties to that agreement meet at what's called the Conference of Parties. So COP is an acronym for Conference of Parties, but it refers to the parties to the Paris Treaty. And each year they meet and negotiate on commitments that the countries will make towards addressing the threat of climate change. And there are 3 major areas that they negotiate in. The first is mitigation, which is the attempt to slow, limit, and hopefully eventually stop and reverse the negative impacts of climate change. The second is adaptation, which is recognizing that climate change is occurring, even as we're trying to slow it and stop it. And that requires changing the way things are done to adapt to the new realities of a hotter world. So mitigation is the first, adaptation is the second, and the third is finance, which is how to pay for the actions to limit and reduce the effect, and how to pay for the needed adaptations to a hotter world. And this year's COP was a focus on the finance. Technically, all 3 are supposed to be running in parallel, but very often they can't manage to progress on all 3 fronts at once. And so the key thing that they were focused on this year they were supposed to be negotiating on all three, but they postponed further negotiations on mitigation and on adaptation and just focused on finance.
Well, in a minute, we'll get to how successful they were or were not in your view. But as an observer, were you representing one or more organizations? How did you get there as an observer?
So I was an observer for the League of Women Voters of the United States. Now, there are many, many organizations that have a general observer status with the United Nations. Several that I belong to. The League of Women Voters is one. I'm a Quaker. Quakers also have observer status at the United Nations. I was also a member of Soroptimist. They also have observer status at the United Nations. And all kinds of organizations have this status. And then for the climate change negotiations, particularly, there are hundreds and probably thousands of organizations that also have observer status at the climate change organization. And there's so many, they're divided into groups. There are 9 official groups of the kinds of observers that there are, and 3 informal groups. And the League of Women Voters belongs to 2 of those groups, the environmental NGOs and women's NGOs. So,
and then do you report back do you write a written report, or how do you interface then with the organization after it's over?
So, well, first I should say the UN has been expanding the number of observers at the COPs. And so this means that the traditional observers are getting fewer credentials, which means they can have fewer people. And the League of Women Voters used to be able to send several people. And this year they could only send 1 at a time. You can share the badge over time. So another observer went the first week and I went the second week of the thing. And our remit, I should say, the COP is huge. There were over 50,000 people attending it. And thousands of journalists. The press area is like a huge football field filled with desks with journalists from most of these countries, nearly 200 countries that are partners. There are a lot of people watching the negotiations themselves, one way or the other. But in addition to the negotiations, it's also like a combination similar to a trade fair and a big academic convention. So there are, for one thing, a lot of the organizations there are doing press conferences throughout, talking about different issues. There are a lot of expert panels on hundreds of different subjects, scientific subjects, governing subjects, about agriculture, about how cities are handling things, different youth groups about the impact that's happening. So there's just a lot going on. And my remit was, they said if I wanted to watch the negotiations, I was welcome to. But what I should really do is find the things that were interesting to me and report on them. So it was almost more like being a color commentator, because, again, a lot of journalists, a lot of official people following the negotiations and reporting on what was happening there. So it's not like I was going to add value by watching the negotiations themselves.
So it's really about, I think you're saying it's really about transparency and accessibility to just widen 50,000 people plus reporters. I mean, the idea seems to be to just make this wide open and observable to representatives of sections of the entire world, right?
Right, and the league said, figure out what's interesting to you, and write something up and presented sort of as you will. The person who went the first week is an academic at a university in Colorado, and she had kind of a blog thing where she posted reports each day on the university website. In my case, I posted little updates, several a day, on our Facebook page, our local League of Women Voters of the San Juans Facebook page. And the person from the League of Women Voters of the US who was sort of in charge of us just checked our updates there each day. And at the end, I copied them all into a document and emailed them to them. And then their other hope was that once that we came back, that we would make ourselves available to talk to people about what we saw, to raise awareness in our communities and among other League members.
And here we are. We're doing just that. Right?
Yeah. So thank you for helping me sort of carry out that part of my remit.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about the results, the outcomes of the conference. Mitigation and adaptation were not the focus. Finance was the focus. So did they do a good job of reaching agreements on finance?
There was a lot of questions about whether they were going to reach it at all. So the negotiations were formally scheduled for 2 weeks, and they were due to end on a Friday. And on the morning of that Friday, they were no closer to agreement than they'd been at the beginning of the week. And they had been working overnight to come up with a new text that was supposed to be released at noon that day for further negotiations to get a final text. And that text did not come out until 3 p.m. And the whole negotiations ended up being extended another 2 days while they hammered out the final from that draft text. That draft text, up until this time, there had been roughly $100 billion committed each year to finance various activities and things. The sort of what was collectively referred to as the Global South, or the non-G20 countries who do very little of the emissions and are facing the majority of the impact. We're estimating that the needed mitigation and adaptation costs, as well as loss and damages, meant that to do that, you would need to commit $1.3 trillion a year. So that was their goal. Of course, the countries that were doing most of the ponying up had been committing $100 billion. The number that they came out with in that 3 p.m. draft text was $250 billion, which was a considerable increase from what was happening, but still nowhere near what was asked for, what was needed. And the final number after 2 more days of negotiation was $300 billion. So a tripling of the amount, but still well short of the amount of money needed.
And then in the big picture, this was about wealthy countries helping poor countries deal with climate change.
Well, yes and no, because actually most of the money that is committed to climate change each year is spent by and in the wealthy countries, and only a small fraction of that is going to developing countries, which is another part of it. So the wealthier countries are committing big dollars, but they're mostly spending them on their own efforts, which to some extent, most of the mitigation needs to be done by those countries. They're the ones who are responsible for most of the emissions. However, a lot of the adaptation needs to happen in the other countries, and a very small percentage of the money is flowing to those countries. So that's part of the problem. That it's fine that wealthy countries spend a lot of money on these things, but committing a lot of money that you're only spending on yourselves isn't really tackling the bigger problem.
Right.
So other issues, the number was just one segment of these negotiations. The other was the structure of the money and how much of it is loans and how much of it is grants and where the money is going. So all of these were also complicated negotiations, and which I think they did not resolve a lot of the outstanding issues in that area. A lot of the money is still loans. And for the global south, many of whom are already over indebted, more loans are not a practical source of help to them.
Global south, meaning, I guess, mostly Africa and South America? What does that mean, global south?
Well, again, that it's kind of a collective that covers all the countries except for the G20 countries. And this, again, is another big issue in the climate negotiations, because 30 years ago, when the Paris Agreement was signed, China and India and Brazil are all considered part of the global south, and they are not countries that are on the hook to put much money forward. And people are now saying China is now the global world power. It's the highest emitter. The US is second. China and the US are number one and number two in emissions. It's a global economic power, but it's still categorized in the other category. So it's not contributing as much money to this fund. And there's, the case is similar with other countries that have been rapidly developing and are now, middle income status countries, but are still categorized the way they were when these agreements were initially signed 30 years ago. And they're reluctant to sort of graduate, shall we say, in terms of the climate change commitments.
Do you happen to remember how much of the 300 billion is from the U.S.?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay. And that would be whatever the U.S. contribution is in this thing would be a matter of policy, right? All the way up to the president. Do you anticipate changes now with the new president in terms of the America's enthusiasm in participating in this?
Well, this was a question that was on people's minds at COP29, and some people thought it would be the big question, but it turned out not to be so much. It was addressed in some of the press conferences and panels that I was at, but it was more like a background buzz than a central issue. The assumption was last time when Trump was in office, he pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement. And he said that he will do it again. And I think people were expecting that. The question was kind of how much difference will that make? Now, last time when he did this, a large coalition of states and cities and companies created an organization called We're Still In, which basically said, whatever the federal government does, we're committed to our climate change commitments and policies, and will continue to move forward. So those people are still around, and that's grown. The federal government is a slow-moving object. So, for instance, the Secretary of Agriculture was there. Agriculture has a big role in climate change policies, and they've had a lot of programs to help farmers shift, both to reduce emissions, to do adaptation. And because farmers are really on the leading edge, they're the people that see these impacts, are seeing them, have been seeing them. So they know it's real, they need to adapt. And Department of Agriculture has seen a lot of uptake in these programs from farmers who continue to be interested in figuring out how to do this and taking part. And the funding for these things is often appropriated not 1 year at a time, but for several years in advance. So funding for these programs runs for 2 to 4 years for the most part, and will keep going. And that's the case in a lot of areas. So if there's an impact, it's still probably a couple of years down the road, because you don't just stop things on a dime. A lot of these things will just keep running. And most of the action has to be taken at the local level anyway. Cities are really important. They're the source of most emissions. And something like 11,000 cities have their own climate plans and own climate commitments worldwide. 800 of them have commitments to net zero. Again, they're also both big on the emissions and mitigation side, but also very on the ground when it comes to impacts. So given that a lot of this action has to take place locally, and those places are going to keep dealing with it and doing what they can, sort of dampens the amount of impact.
Well, there'll be a COP30, I guess, which would be the 30th year of this.
Yes.
That's where the 29 comes from. We didn't mention that, but
Yes.
there'll be a COP30, and we'll see just whether or not the new president impacts the Americans' role in COP30. So just have to wait for that, I guess. But if there will be a COP30, will you go, or was this your one time as an observer?
That will be hard to say. Normally, the league has had more credentials and has sent more observers. This time, I saw a notice that the National League was looking for people that were willing to do it. They asked us to pay our own way, so that's one consideration. And I threw my name in the hat, and I think there were 12 of us who did. And then it turned out there was one credential. I should say, besides the two of us that went in person, there's an unlimited number who can observe virtually, so from home via Zoom. So several people did that as well. And I think in the end, they pulled names from a hat to decide who would go in person. So
all these years later, you're still competing, still have to compete.
Well, I'm not sure it's a competition when they just pull your name from a hat.
Yeah, that's true. All right. Well, thank you for, by the way, we didn't mention how far you had to travel. Where was this?
So it was in Baku, Azerbaijan. That's exactly 12 time zones from where we are. So if it was 5 in the morning here, it was 5 p.m. there, and vice versa.
It could not have been farther away, unless it was on the moon, right?
Yeah, well, more or less halfway around the world, yeah.
Yeah, that's something. Well, Necia, thank you for sharing with us your amazing opportunity to represent America, represent the Quakers, represent the League of Women Voters. I guess in spirit, you were representing the Soroptimists. And in an important way, you were representing San Juan County and San Juan Island. So thank you times 5. That was great. And I think a lot of people wouldn't imagine that you had to pay your own way. So it just shows also your level of commitment and curiosity, probably, as well. You seem like a very curious person. Yes.
And I have to say, going to the COP, I was not an expert in climate change. I think I was, as informed as a moderately well-informed person interested in international relations is, but nothing close to an expert, even though environmental issues were usually in my portfolio when I was overseas. And I'm still not an expert, but I am much better informed, and it's kind of terrifying.
Well, you did good. You did good. So, folks, this is Necia Quast. She is one of the hundreds, if not a few thousand exceptional, amazing people in the San Juans. It's always a pleasure to get to know the very special people of the San Juans. So, Necia, I see you all the time when I go to meetings, and I really appreciate again what you're doing at the local level. And I thank you for taking some time out to share this with us on Friday the 13th. So you better maybe stay there at home and shut the windows, shut the drapes, and just stay there till tomorrow. But
well, thank you again.
thank you very much. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you soon.